So here we are once again. It's been a really, really long time, but it's the Good podcast, and we're back. So welcome back.
Has it been a long time in the grand scheme of things?
That's a great question.
Yeah, I think if you look at the life of our podcast, it's been pretty long.
Yeah, in comparison to the existence of the Good podcast. It's been a while.
Yeah. So maybe we take a little moment to reintroduce ourselves. My name is Hayden, and here I am. I work at City Light now, which is cool. But I'm just excited to be here. Who are you?
My name's Harry, and I don't work at a church.
Yeah.
Nor do I have any claim
to
Christian fame.
And we appreciate that about you.
And that's what I bring to the table.
Hayden, do you have claim to Christian fame?
No.
Are you? Okay, good.
He's Christian famous.
Christian famous.
He's Hayden.
He is Hayden. People do know you.
Everybody
knows.
knows. Yeah.
Fair enough.
Anyway, who are you?
My name is Chris. I work at a church too. And this is my home, and don't try to find me. That'd be weird.
Yeah. This is a very nice home, by the way.
It's so nice.
It changed rapidly with the emergence of a child into your life. So.
Yes, I'm a father now, so that's a huge aspect of my life.
Yeah, all of a sudden you'll be able to relate to this text.
I'm like, yes, children.
Yes, in ways that you've never related.
I have a concept for that now. Children.
Yep. Yes.
Yeah, so I'm the odd man out, but not for too much longer.
Just wait a couple months.
God willing.
Yeah, that's some good background. Yeah, I have a 6-year-old. Chris has a newborn, and Hayden has a fetus waiting to be born.
It's the size of an avocado.
Dude, those apps to tell you what size it is every single day. Wait till it's the size of a cantaloupe. And so he's like, it's the size of a roll of toilet paper. Yeah, that's messed up.
Yeah, that is crazy. So, a little while ago, we kind of rebooted, started a new season of Good Podcast, and the way we started was I read the Book of Ephesians in its entirety, which was fun and cool, and I read it by the old, the Kingdom New Testament by N.T. Wright, which is cool, and I think maybe hopefully helpful to anyone that was listening, just the way that he talks about things is cool. Why did we pick Ephesians, Harry?
So, for a reason that might not be what you would think, I was like, why don't we just read in their entirety books of the Bible? Because there's a lot of low-hanging fruit in the Bible. And fortunately, a lot of those come in the letters. Because Paul writes a lot of letters, and some are longer than others, but some are 20-minute reads, which is really, really nice. But some are in the Old Testament, which hopefully we get into as well. But I think that that's something that is just so not done in our, what's your favorite verse, Christian culture. I think, it was really, really helpful for me to hear you read through the whole of the letter to the Ephesians, because you get it from beginning to end. Whether you listen to it once or listen to it 10 times, you get this full breadth of the thought process of the person writing it. So I wanted to go for that long-hanging fruit. I wanted to, number one, start off a series or whatever. I don't even know how many times we're going to talk about this, maybe once, but a little new series with what is that 20 or 30 minute story, reading, letter, or whatever it is, and then talk about it after we hear it in its entirety.
Yeah. I think there's a huge amount to be said for what you're saying too. Right now in Christian culture, it's super popular to have a favorite verse and that's not necessarily bad. It's good to have that stuff to memorize that stuff and to know it. But being able to look at the book as a whole and look at the themes that go throughout it and the story that it's telling you, not just picking a verse out, is I think gives you a really different perspective.
It's actually funny. So I did go through confirmation as a teenager because my mom made me do it.
Okay.
And to graduate.
Your family Catholic?
No.
Okay.
This was Methodist.
Oh, Methodist confirmation. Cool.
And so to graduate or whatever, I had to sit down with the pastor and he quizzed me basically. And then one of his questions was what's your favorite verse? And I was like, I know an answer to this one. It's John 3:16. And I'm really glad he didn't ask me to say it, because I would not have known what the actual words were to the verse.
That's awesome.
Yeah. But then actually someone recently asked me what my favorite verse was. So oh yeah, the little widgets on your phone used to have a little quote. And I was like, I don't even know. I had to really think of it.
Yeah, that's true. One of my favorites definitely comes out of Ephesians that we'll get to at some point. But I like what you're saying, how, there's a necessity to read it from top to bottom, and I think as I was kind of taking notes, reading through it, it becomes super evident. I'm just going to jump straight in. When we get to Ephesians, this is just something I noticed. Ephesians chapter 1, verse 7, and I'll read it, and again in my version. In the King and through his blood we have deliverance. That is, our sins have been forgiven through the wealth of his grace which he lavished on us. And so I was like, as I was reading and studying that, I was like, I feel like that's basically the whole gospel as we tend to hear it. Is like, Jesus, by his death, delivered you from sins, forgiven. And that's like the whole thing. And you're like, boom. And so I'm like, okay, if he got to that in verse 7, what the heck is the rest of this thing about?
Yeah. Why would I even read the rest of this?
Why read it?
I got my feel-good statement 7 sentences in.
Yeah, and so the only conclusion I can possibly come to is that's not the whole thing.
Yeah.
If anything, that's like to hook you in, to be like, hey, here's some good news. Now let's talk about that, because instead of just like taking it for granted, you actually have to think through what that means for you practically as a human.
Right. I think it helps too, maybe looking at this from the people that would have first heard this, they know like the assumptions and the foundation that Paul's making before he gets into anything else. Like if you're going to listen to Paul, then you need to know that he believes Christ is the Messiah and like he died for our sins. So okay, now that that's out of the way, like let's talk about it.
And I don't want to be misunderstood. Like that is a huge like foundational piece of the Christian faith and the gospel. Clearly, again, he did say it in verse 7, meaning that it's an important thing to like lead off with. So not trying to say like, oh, that's not the gospel, because like it definitely is.
Right.
That is good news.
And this kind of stuff is awesome too, because you don't. Like, Paul's letters help us so much because you don't get this stuff necessarily spelled out for you in the Gospels. Like, you have to kind of interpret it. And what you get from Paul is somebody after Christ that has interpreted that and is in the process of interpreting it.
Before even reading the Gospels, historically, This is him, like, freshly thinking about years after Jesus' death. What does this actually mean?
Yeah, that's wild. Yeah, just hearing the stories, having his own personal encounter with Jesus, and then just thinking about it and preaching and doing it. So I think that's a really cool thing, and I think when you read Ephesians top to bottom, you do get a very full picture of what Paul believed to be is the wholeness of the gospel. And so he does, like, he starts off in chapter 1 and he's like, this is like what the gospel is, to start off that Jesus died for the forgiveness of your sins. But then he keeps going into verse 10, and I think this is actually maybe the more full picture of what he thinks. And so he says, which was lavished on us, yet, yes, with all wisdom and insight, he has made known to us the secret of his purpose, just as he wanted it to be and set forward in him as a blueprint for when the time is right. Here it is. His plan was to sum up the whole cosmos in the King. Yes, everything in heaven and on earth in him. And I think that's really more of his like gospel statement message. And the reason I'm saying that with like pretty like good confidence is because when you read the rest of the letter, that's kind of what he begins to flesh out, the implications of what that is.
Yeah, in my NIV it says to bring unity to all things in heaven and on earth under Christ. And I think that is reflected by who he addresses throughout the letter and like what issues he brings up and like how he speaks into those people's lives. It's certainly not to like, it is to like one group of people, and we can talk about that as well, but it's to everybody, like regardless of status, to bring unity, which I think is an oft forgotten piece of Paul. I think everyone wants to read Paul and they're like, who is he excluding? Like, who is he calling out? Who is he setting aside? And it's like, nah, he's being extremely generous with who he includes in his statements and who he's talking to.
Yeah. Yeah, so I mean, maybe just going with that. In verse 1, we kind of skipped over this. But who is the letter to? Well, he literally gives a from and to right at the beginning. From Paul, one of King Jesus' apostles through God's purpose. To the holy ones in Ephesus who are loyal believers in King Jesus. That's how N.T. Wright puts it.
Mine says some early manuscripts do not have in Ephesus.
Sure.
And remember, 16-year-old Harry would be like, what? don't want to read this. This is stupid.
Yeah.
It's a letter to nobody. But is that important?
Yeah, we have a chunk of letters that are, prison writings, and this is one of them. And we know he went to Ephesus before he wrote this, and he's going to return again.
Yeah.
And so I think, does he call out people's names in this?
Not really. He kind of, at the end, he says, oh, by the way, like, it's good for you to know how I'm doing, so I'm sending to you Tychicus, I believe, is who he sends. Mm-hmm. But other than that, he really doesn't call out people's names, and so I think...
It's probably an educated guess, then?
I think it is, in knowing N.T. Wright, who's basically devoted his life to the study of Paul. It's probably a pretty good educated guess. And yeah, like having listened to Paul, a biography by N.T. Wright, he's got good reasons for thinking this, and he wouldn't have included that in Ephesus if he didn't believe that's what it was.
And if 16-year-old Harry, you're getting hung up on that, I think let's take it a step broader. He's talking to a group of believers. Mm-hmm. So he's not trying to convince a group of unbelievers or, someone who is just new to the gospel. It seems as though he's talked to these people before. They believe Jesus is the Messiah, and he is now expanding on that already existing belief, which I think is important to set the scene, because you're going to talk very differently to somebody who is new to that message as opposed to someone who, is a group of believers to God's holy people, which I think is he's addressing them as such.
I think that's good. Yeah, it doesn't really make a practical difference for us. Mm-hmm. And I'd say too, I'm looking at what you said, and it says 3 early manuscripts don't contain at Ephesus, but that means that there are some that do. Mm-hmm. So the exclusion of it doesn't mean that it's nefarious and trying to confuse us. Mm-hmm. It just means that some people might have left it out.
Yeah. And maybe for the purpose of being this is actually really well applicable to not just Ephesus, but to literally everyone.
Yeah. And that happened a lot. Yeah. They would take these letters and they would pass them along.
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe Ephesus recopied it, kept their own copy, and they're like, well, this isn't us anymore, so let's send it to these people, but they need to hear it too, who knows. Good point. And so I think, what's interesting is the kind of 2 ways that, again, my translation calls it out is to the holy ones in Ephesus who are loyal believers in King Jesus, which I think is interesting. And again, that sets the framework along with that verse 7, you're forgiven for your sins, and the verse 10, the summing up of all things in Christ. Those 3 verses kind of set the framework for where he's going to go. Mm-hmm. But I did think it was interesting, if you were to say what is a Christian, I don't think we would necessarily use that often, where it's a holy one that's loyally believing in King Jesus.
Yeah. Looking at that first chunk, what would it be verse 1 to, I think you kind of cut it off at verse 10, but even past that a little bit. This is something I brought up to you, Hayden, when I just first read this, and this I think is let's dumb it down a little bit for me. I see in him being repeated so many times, and I think that's one of those things that when people are praying, they just throw it out, or Paul's just using it, and I truly, when I was reading that, I was what does that kind of mean? I don't quite understand what that means, and I feel Paul probably meant it in a very different way than maybe somebody using it in a contemporary setting as well. So is that something you guys can shed light on for me?
I mean, literally, it's the same thing. The words are just that.
Literally in, I would put cookies in a jar.
Yeah. I think the way we generally take that as modern English speakers is probably correct. Mm-hmm. Not I'm physically in him, but that I'm maybe that I'm within his presence, or my soul belongs to him, or something associative like that without being physical. Mm-hmm. But that's kind of nebulous.
He throws it out so many times,
Yeah.
in like 10 sentences, like in him, in him, in him, in him.
Yeah.
And like what I'm hearing from you is kind of like it's like Phil Collins, you'll be in my heart. You know,
Yeah.
It's like not like literally in your beating heart, but
Right.
but on like a cosmic level.
Yeah.
You know.
And I think that is where he goes. And again, like the whole point of why I was bringing up, he starts with the forgiveness of sins, but then he ends chapter 1, verse 20 through 23. And I think that's where he like actually like to him, this is the good news. And I'll just read it. This was the power at work in the king when God raised him from the dead and sat him at his right hand in the heavenly places, above all rule and authority and power and lordship, and above every name that is invoked both in the present age and also the age to come. Yes, God has put all things under his feet and has given him to the church as the head over all. The church is his body. It is the fullness of the one who fills all in all. Mm-hmm. And so I think that's really his gospel. And then and then the rest of the letter is just him kind of pulling out the implications of what that means. And so he's like, here's the good news. Yeah, like it starts with Jesus' life, the incarnation, his death, and then really though, the real good power is his resurrection, that he is above and bringing all things under his feet, under his rulership.
Well, and also I think to a Roman or to a Greek or to somebody hearing the first gospel message that you said, that like Christ died for your sins, like that would be revolutionary, but it wouldn't like get them killed. Like the statement that you just said, where it's like straight up, Jesus Christ is ruler over all. God placed him at his right hand. Like he has authority over every church. He has authority over every dominion, every name.
Yeah.
That would get you killed. Like that's you placing Jesus Christ above emperors and kings and all this stuff. And like that is the big tasty statement to close out the first chapter for sure.
Yeah.
It kind of falls on deaf ears, I think, in 2020.
Yeah, and it has huge implications, and that's what he begins to then draw out through the rest of the thing. And I think that's like where he's going with the in him thing. It's like, okay, you're now loyally believing in King Jesus, so you are in his kingdom. Mm-hmm. Here's what it looks like. What were you going to say, Chris?
I feel like Ephesians, the way it starts, but also the whole book is just very spiritual as opposed to like literal. Like Paul likes to do both. Yeah. But Ephesians is very spiritual. Right from the beginning, he's talking about these concepts that you kind of just have to like sit outside your head for a second and listen to, because they're just, I mean, compared to his other like letters where he's like, say hi, like greetings to this person, greetings to this person, like right from the beginning, he's just...
He must have been in a very spiritual mood.
Yeah.
Because you're right. One of the things I like about Paul is how practical he gets in other letters, where he's like, do this and feel this way. If you're struggling with this, do this. And here he's for sure very ethereal in like his descriptions of God.
Yeah. Makes Ephesians a pretty unique letter among the letters.
Yeah.
Which is something that kind of cool to think about. Like, if you have a hard time remembering the letters, maybe this is something you pull out of in the beginning. Like, okay, Ephesians, that's the kind of the spiritual book. Mm-hmm. Where do I go from here?
Yeah, I think that's a really good thing to actually kind of stop and refocus in, because I was about ready to like launch into some things I think really wouldn't make sense unless you had like the right mindset of what he's actually talking about when he's saying both the rulers in the heavenly places and the earthly places. And so yeah, it's something that if you've been listening to the Bible Project, keeping up with them, they're really honing in on this right now, which I think is really cool. Talking about how Jesus' death and resurrection confronts kind of two sides of evil. Yeah. One being like the Roman oppressors, like the literal, they are ruling over you, they literally have control over you physically. But then zooming back and going, okay, well, who's actually in charge, so to speak? Who's driving the Romans to do what they do? And it's these evil spiritual powers that are influencing them and saying like, hey, actually, it's good for you to be separating yourself from the Jews. It's good for you to be like lording over these people, because you're the ones who are in power. You're the ones who are in charge. And so they're talking about how like Jesus' death and resurrection confronts both and puts them both under his rulership. He confronts the spiritual powers and the physical powers. And like without that framework, I think the rest of what he's saying doesn't really make a ton of sense.
Yeah, it definitely loses power
Yeah.
if you don't think about it that way.
Well, and it's also going to speak right into the heart of a Jew, because from page 1 of the Bible, there is lordship over earth given to humans, and there's lordship over the heavens given to, not humans.
Right.
And then Jesus comes to say, all authority in heaven and earth has been given to me.
Yeah.
Like, that's something he literally says. And this, you're right, like expands on that in a very, very practical way.
Yeah. And not to go too much into this, but I feel like it's easier to go one or the other a lot. And maybe you're like, well, Jesus conquered the spiritual realm, and that's kind of easy for me to understand. I'm just going to separate him from like my practical life.
Right.
Like I know he conquered the spiritual realm. Like he's more powerful than demons and all that. But like practically, like I don't really live like he's my king.
Yeah.
Or you go the opposite way, and you're like, well, he's ruler over everything here, but I'm, still afraid of what's going to happen to me after death, or I'm still afraid of demons, and I'm not really sure that, like, those things still exist or not.
Well, you're tapping on literally like one of the biggest struggles I have, and like we don't need to go too deep into this, but like it's the tension and the push and pull between, okay, could I live in this incredibly spiritual mindset, which is Jesus died for my sins, I'm saved, praise hallelujah, life is just so good because of it, and then like disregard the practical, or let's push the seesaw the other way. Am I like super concerned with every little thing that I do, which might make me feel super good, and then might make me feel super worried and bad sometimes, and not have faith in the spiritual side of things.
Right.
Like,
not trust like the spiritual side. Yeah.
I feel like those are at war. And like,
and I feel like it's so hard to do both.
Yes.
I like maybe I probably go more towards I can have the appearance of a Christian and I can do the right things, but in my mind, like I don't think of Jesus as my king a lot.
Mm-hmm.
Like that's probably where I more often go. But I feel like I go to one or the other way more than I go to both.
Yeah, I feel like we're actually hitting on like something we should talk about in a later podcast episode, which is works versus you don't need works.
Faith.
Yes.
Yeah.
Works versus faith.
Well, yeah, and I think he gets there, and so maybe we'll just keep going and get there. But I think it's interesting because so you set up with that framework, and then he knocks it out of the park, and then he hits both sides of things and pulls out the implications. But it's interesting. So chapter 2, he focuses on that spiritual, personal salvation from the spiritual evil. Like, since Jesus has conquered the spiritual powers of evil, here's what that means for you in your spiritual life. And that's chapter 2. And then chapters 3, 4, and 5, and then into 6 are basically all about the other side. Like, so if that's true, and he's conquered the human powers, what does that part mean? And so I think it's interesting just to point out, he spends one chapter, aka 22 verses, on the spiritual side of conquering, which is incredibly important. But because of that, he spends more time, like way more time, talking about, okay, what does that mean for your physical, personal relationships here and now?
What does it mean for you as a husband and a wife? What does it mean for you as a parent or a child?
Exactly.
Yeah.
I think that's interesting too, because I talked about earlier how Ephesians seems more spiritual than the other ones. It shows you like how little there actually is in the Bible just addressing that.
Yes.
And again, like, you need them both for them to make any sense. But yeah, we live in a physical world, and so I think it's just good to know that, like, even though the forgiveness of sins is where he starts, he spends so much more time in the other things.
Yeah, that makes me think of Jesus too. It's like, what questions were people asking Jesus? They were asking him, like, who do I pay taxes to? Or like, if so-and-so gets divorced to so-and-so and then that person dies, like, we're asking him stupid practical questions, that is, and maybe Paul is sensing that, believers want that and need that.
Yeah, I think that, and he's got a letter to write, and who knows how long, like, he already writes stupid long letters, but he's thinking, I have to give these people something practical, because yes, it's important that I address all this, but what do they do with it? Like, that's the important part.
Yeah, exactly. And so, again, though, I think it's good to know that he starts with the spiritual side of things, because that is the greater power behind it. Like, if we just work on the physical plane of existence, so to speak, and we just try to be better husbands, we just try to be better fathers, we just try to be better sons, try to be better workers,
right?
Like, none of it matters unless the ultimate spiritual authorities have been conquered. And so that's where he starts in chapter 2, and he focuses in on just God's grace and mercy, and going to that works versus faith thing. He makes it really clear. He's like, so I love the way N.T. Wright puts it, and that's why I chose this as the translation that I'm using. He says, so where do you come into it all? And you're just like, yes, thank you. That is what I was wondering.
What does this mean?
That was the question that I was asking throughout the whole first chapter.
Yeah, and then so he says, well, you were dead because of your offenses and sins. That was the road you used to travel. And so he's like, again, the spiritual side of things. You were spiritually dead.
Mm-hmm.
And so God was handing you over to the consequences of those decisions. That you would head into just chasing after kind of animal tendencies of just like going after whatever you wanted.
Right.
Ultimately, that was going to lead to death. And the way he says that is, what was the result? We too were subject to wrath in our natural state, just like everyone else. But when it comes to mercy, God is rich. He had such great love for us that he took us at the very point which we were at, dead through our offenses, and made us alive together in the King. And so, that's his moment right there, is like, okay, so you were walking in a way of separation from God, which ultimately was going to lead you to death. There was nothing that you did. Jesus just met you at that point and opened up the door for salvation.
Yeah, and that's the grace part, right? Yeah. Like, it can't be by anything you've done.
Yeah, exactly. And then, so I think it's interesting. Then he goes on and kind of closes that part by says, this was so that in the ages to come, he would be able to show how unbelievably rich his grace is and the kindness he has shown us in King Jesus. And so I think a lot of times too, when we see that spiritual side of things, we're like, Jesus saved me. This is about me. Mm-hmm. And it's like, okay, he did that to demonstrate the only way he could demonstrate the fullness of how loving, how gracious, how merciful he is if he did that, and that's why he did it. He didn't do it just because like he wanted to save you, although he did, and like that's good, but like he did it for you to recognize like this is how great God is.
Well, and once again, I mean, like literally, you got to the zinger. You got to like this is my favorite Bible verse quote. For it is by grace you have been saved through faith, and this is not from yourselves, it is the gift of God, not by works, so that no one can boast. And like that is seemingly contradictory to like what would be like James, like writing like it's all about works. Go after the poor and the orphans and the widows and stuff like that. And like I feel like there is a healthy tension to live in, and Paul's trying to expose that. He's starting with the gospel. He's bringing it down to the fact that Jesus is your king, and you being in him means that you are a part of his new kingdom, and you were literally dead, but he brought you alive. But then the next verse is him saying we were created in Christ Jesus to do good works. So he's not absolving you of doing good works. He's not saying, praise hallelujah, wonderful, I've been saved, now it doesn't matter what I do. He's saying like, actually, that is the end sentence of this thought process. You should do good works because of these reasons that I just listed off.
Yeah, and it's almost the way Ephesians is set up. It's like giving you the foundation of why, and then very next it's giving you the practical. And like this is what God did spiritually. Saved you by grace. These are things you can't understand, can't work for, but it's so that you can do good works for him. Yes. And so that you would understand his love.
And I think too, a lot of time we think of good works as being like being a good person and just like being good. And again, that is part of it. At the beginning, he says like that you are called to be holy. Like that's one of the things you're called to, set apart and living differently from the world. And that's what he's going to explain through the rest of the thing. But then in chapter 3, verse 7, he sees his good work as something very specific, and it's here he says it. This is the gospel that I was appointed to serve, and he says the secret is this, that through the gospel the Gentiles are to share in Israel's inheritance. his good work is to proclaim that there's no longer this separation
Jews
between
and Gentiles.
Jews and Gentiles, and that's what he sees the good work as. Not just like, oh, and Jesus saved me so that I could be better. He was like the best person you could be,
Technically, yes.
at the time, before Jesus saved him. He was living a very righteous life.
Right. And this is his calling too,
Yeah.
right? Paul is called as somebody that was born Jewish, is a Roman citizen, to unite the Jews and the Gentiles. So he's like, this is it. Like, this is why I'm here. This is why I'm talking to you.
And you're using a buzzword of like, this is his calling. And I think, Hayden, you said kind of what that can mean. Whereas everybody wants to be a better husband. Everybody wants to be a better wife. Everybody wants to be a better friend. Like you want to be those things. Like I think that's a natural human inclination for you to want to be better than you were yesterday, to be the best you can be. But Paul's saying, here's who you were before, and here's who you can be now if you do it for Jesus, if you do it for God. And then he gives his own testament. This is who I was, and this is who I am now. And they look extremely different because I'm not doing it for myself or, for the wrong reasons. I'm doing it for God.
Yeah. And I think the other thing too that's really interesting is the reason he throws out it's by grace you have been saved through faith and not of good works is actually not to say, hey, so being a good person isn't what gets you there. The reason he says it is to say, so there's now under Christ no distinction between those who are circumcised and following the law and those who aren't. Like,
No,
that's the reason
Yes.
that he throws it out there, and that's what the rest of chapter 2 is all about. And he's like, so here's the thing, if Jesus is king over all of both again, and this is where he goes to the earthly thing, if he's king over all the earthly kingdoms, then that means he's not just king over Israel. He's not just king over those who are circumcised and following the law. He's king over the Gentiles too, and he's calling them into his family. And then that's important because then there's no reason to not have peace. There's a place where he says that, and I'll try to find it later. Yeah. But like that's kind of his implication is there. So because that's true, that peace should abound out of that because you're no longer at war with the Gentiles. You're no longer at war with these other people.
Right.
All you have to do is just call them into the kingdom, and then there's peace.
Yeah, and what a powerful message that is. Because the whole thought of distinction can be played throughout the whole Bible, and it can be played right up until today. It was, who gave sacrifices or not, who tithed the most, who prayed the loudest, who was circumcised, who was not circumcised, who went to church every single Sunday. And it's like, that's not what it's about.
And all of those things you just listed, like separate class, to separate economic status, gender, like what you were born into, like your nationality. And like that's how a lot of them were defined. And he's saying like not anymore.
Well, and I think what Paul's really attacking there is like judgment.
Yeah.
Like, so that none can boast, there is no distinction. You cannot judge between Jew or Gentile. You cannot judge between anybody. I'm addressing all of you.
Which is why it's so cool that Paul's the one that does this. Like, this is what just blows my mind.
Yeah.
Like, and it makes sense God would pick him to do this, but I love the practicality of it.
Yeah.
God's like, this is like
perfect.
one of the most powerful Jewish people. He's born into it, trained under like this master rabbi, and he's a Roman citizen. So he understands both perfectly, and he's saying like, neither are better.
Yeah. Yeah, and so the verse I was referencing is chapter 2, verse 17. So the Messiah came and gave the good news. Here's the good news. Peace had come. Peace, that is, for those who were a long way away, and peace, too, for those who were close at hand.
I feel like we should, like, if we could find a way to contact NT Wright and be like, can you give us a code that we can give our listeners so they can get 10% off of this freaking text? Because it is so good.
Yeah.
It's so good.
Yeah, it's very helpful.
Yeah.
And so then, it's so good. His Paul's implication then is if Jesus is the king again over the spiritual powers and over the earthly powers, then there's no possible separation. And then so he gets really practical for the rest of basically the rest of the thing until he gets to a little bit into verse 6. But then he's like, okay, so if there's no separation of Jew and Gentile, then in chapter 3 and 4, he starts to be like, so what does that look like? And he starts getting really, really practical with it, being like, okay, so here's what it looks like. It looks like you're all united as one family. And I'll try to find the verse where he really gets throwing down on that.
Well, at first he talks about members together of one body, which I think is a very vivid picture.
Yeah.
And I feel like Paul references that in other books too.
Yes,
like
he does.
The hands and feet of Jesus and stuff like
Yeah.
that. You know.
Yeah. The Bible Project puts it a really good way, and this is kind of their summary of chapter 4. They say Jesus brings unity, but unity doesn't equal uniformity. And I think that was a really great way to put it, because it's like, okay, so Jesus brings us into one body, into one family of which he is the head over. But that doesn't mean that we all look the same, that we all act the same, that we all have the same gifts. In fact, the diversity that was separating you before is actually going to be the strength of this new body. And that's where, he gets into chapter 4, verses 4, and he calls out the unity. There is one body and one spirit. You were all, after all, called to one hope, which goes with your call. There is one Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God, and the Father who is Lord over all, through all, and in all.
It's another zinger.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, absolutely. But then he's like, okay, but unity in all those onenesses doesn't mean uniformity, and he breaks it down at verse 11. So these were the gifts he gave. Some were to be apostles, prophets, evangelists, pastors, and teachers. And by the way, he gave that diversity of the gifts. Why? Because their job is to give God's people the equipment they need for the work of their service to be built up the king's body. And so he's like, so the things that you were distinguishing before as these big separations, they're not separations. There's unity in that. What you should actually be looking for is the distinguishing factors between how God has gifted people, and then be like, we need all those giftings to build up the church. And why, and I think it's interesting, why does he get so emphatic about the church? I think maybe that's a question we can kind of talk to, because you're like, okay, God's king over the earthly things, king over the heavenly things. Why is the church such a big deal? Why is it all for the building up of the church? What do you guys think?
I don't know.
Yeah.
I think my first thought would be the emphasis Jesus places on the church.
Well, in chapter 1, he does say he's above every church.
Yeah.
He's the head of every church.
I mean, it was clearly important to Jesus, like the body of believers. And I think there's a lot of strength that comes from that. And I think what Paul's saying is he's kind of already assuming that you want to be in this body. He's like, this is a good thing, but what you've been doing wrong is finding ways to exclude people because they're different. He's like, I know you want to be a part of this. Like, he's writing to a church, but you have to be he's not saying you have to be more inclusive, but he is saying that. He's saying that, more people should be part of this, and Gentiles and Jews should be part of this. But it's not, I guess to paraphrase what Hayden's saying, it's not what's making you different isn't weakening you, and you shouldn't be focusing on that negatively, but actually that's giving you more strength as a church in the diversity.
What it makes me think of is two things. First off, I think what was going on in Ephesus or wherever in the group of people that he feels like he needs to be this emphatic about a message of unity.
Yeah.
Like, was there some kind of discrimination going on? Like, was there inequality in the church? That he feels like he needs to be this specific about it. And then the second thing that comes to mind is how easily it is for me and anyone else to read a line like, there's one body and one spirit, one Lord, one faith, one baptism, and actually use that exact line to discriminate against others. Like, okay, there's one Lord, one faith, one baptism. By the way, if you don't do those three things, if you don't, go after my Lord, if you don't have my faith, if you don't do my baptism, you're out. It's so easy to, and like you would be literally inverting his entire message if you did that. But like, it's so easy to look at that and just use that as a discriminatory verse.
I think that's why the first two chapters, or especially the first chapter, is so important. Because if you're not in line with who he says God is, like Jesus, then the rest of the stuff isn't going to apply to you anyway.
if you just skip past the whole there is no Jew or Gentile thing,
Yeah.
and then just fill in blanks wherever you want.
I like chapter 3 too because he specifically addresses the Gentiles for a bit.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I think you're right. I think we can use all of this to reject people, but there are parameters he's setting. Like you do need to believe in Jesus.
Yeah. And so it tricked me because it's actually this logic that he's getting to in chapter 4 is actually going back to the spiritual things that he already mentioned in chapter 3, and it's verse 10, and this is what he says. This is it, that God's wisdom in all its rich variety was to be made known to the rulers and authorities in the heavenly places through the church. And so that's really interesting. It's like the church is this physical, tangible representation of the fact that the authorities in the heavenly places don't have the power that they thought they did. It's like they thought they had the power to grab the Roman Empire and make them work for them. They thought they had the power to grab, the Assyrians and make them work for them, the Egyptians make them work for them, the Babylonians make them work for them. And then in here, he's like, but the church being unified as both Jew and Gentile proves to the authorities in the heavenly places that God has conquered them. They don't actually have power anymore because, look, this is a unified family that is full of Babylonians, Assyrians, Egyptians, all those things, Israelites as well, all coming together. And so I think that's why the building up of the church is so important, is because, and why like unity in the church is so important, not uniformity. That doesn't need to be there because our diversity is actually our strength. And that's why it's proving that these separation tactics that is basically all the these spiritual authorities had to do, just separate people, they don't work because Jesus has conquered it.
I feel like you're touching on too what our pastor talked about is like the chiasm structure of this. It's like 3 and 4 playing off each other. And then I was just looking like 2 and 5 play off each other, where it's like you're dead and now you're alive. And then 5 is talking about how you were in darkness and now you're in light. And how 1 and 6 talk to each other. It's a very well put together letter.
This guy's pretty smart.
Yeah, to say the least.
Yeah, he's super smart. And so, I just think that gets so incredibly practical when you start thinking about all that. And then because you're like, okay, so why is he then telling us how to live? Chapter 4, he's basically like, act like one family, be in unity, and then grow up to be like Christ. Don't act like sinners, put off your old life. And then in verse 5, he's like, okay, or in chapter 5, he's like, how do we do that? And he's basically like, well, just love the way that Jesus loved. Again, like, die to your old self and be raised to this new self. And again, the reason is so that the earthly authorities can be shown that they don't have power, and so that the heavenly authorities can be shown that they don't have power. We're not just doing it to be good people. We're being people who follow Jesus, who love like Jesus, who are holy and set apart like Jesus, to prove to the other authorities that are trying to claim their authority that they don't have anything. They don't have the power of sin in our personal lives. We can walk holy, we can walk righteously before Jesus, and not in perfection yet, but we can model that is coming, and we can walk in unity against this powers of separation in the earth and be like, no, actually, like, you think you have all this authority, you think you have the power to separate us? No. Like, we don't allow those things, so you don't have power and you don't have power. And I just think, man, it's so practical, and it takes the, hey, you were saved, and so now just be good, and turns it into like, oh, like, you were saved, and so now show the world this good news that you don't have to live under this sin and separation anymore.
And he takes the societal, in chapter 5, concepts of husband and wife and, slave and master, and he completely puts them on their head, to, once again, send a message to everyone around that, like, we're not living for earthly desires. We're not living in the way that everyone else, tells us we need to be living. We're doing.
You have to be different.
Yes, and you have to do it as Jesus.
Invisibly different to the point that it's uncomfortable. I have a question about what your version says on a chapter. Chapter 4, verse 30. Mm-hmm. This verse always kind of confused me a bit.
Yeah.
I think I know what it's saying.
I'll back up to 29 just to give a little bit of context. Yeah, this is kind of where he's saying, like, so if Christ has saved us, if he's conquered the spiritual powers of your life, how should we act? So he says, don't let any unwholesome words escape your lips. Instead, say whatever is good and will be useful in building people up, so that you will be given grace to those who listen. And don't disappoint God's Holy Spirit, the Spirit who put God's mark on you to identify you on the day of freedom. All bitterness and rage, all anger and yelling, and all blasphemy, put it away from you with all wickedness. And then instead be good and loving and kind. Yeah,
so he puts a conjunction in between 29 and 30.
Kind of strange.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, I do think they're linked. I think he's taken some, probably correct knowing him, but liberty in saying these are together. Well, in my mind, I've always just been like, that's a separate thing.
The verse 30 starts with and. And it's a separate sentence, but it's still connected.
I don't have the Greek in front of me, but I don't think it literally is, but I think it's there to help us go that it is.
Yeah. It is kind of it seems random.
And I think it goes back to what you were saying is that he's weaving in and out the spirit and the spiritual side of the conquering with the physical. He's saying, like, treat people well, don't grieve the spirit. That would grieve the spirit. Yeah. Treat people well.
Mm-hmm. Totally. Yeah. This is once again, the Paul that I like, where he's like, don't do this, don't do that. Everyone likes the do not let the sun go down while you're still angry. You're like, well, man, wow, that's a good lesson. Thank you. That's practical. I'm going to put that one in my fridge. Remember not to do that.
I also like that he says, like, be angry. Like, you can be angry. It's okay. That's good practical for me, too. Yeah. Like, work through that. You're not a sinner just because you're angry.
Yeah.
But it must work.
For sure. Well, yeah, I think, again, the Bible Project's recent series that they're going through has been really helpful for me. Like, if you're confused about God and anger and how those things go well together, how they're not, like, a scary picture of God, just check out the series they're going through, because it's been so helpful for me.
Well, the concept is just so troubling.
Yeah.
And they make it not so much, which is really nice.
Yeah.
All this stuff, is just, you're working through so much language and thousands of years of interpretation, and like some things change a lot and some things don't change a lot. So when you hear of an angry God, you have all these things in your brain that is influenced by the culture you grew up around in, but just might not be what you actually think it is.
Yeah, or so, like you said too, like he's not saying don't ever be angry. He's saying you're gonna be angry. And like I have like an unhealthy relationship with anger. Like I really don't like it. I want to avoid it at all costs, and like that's unsustainable. Mm-hmm. And Paul's not asking us to like an unrealistic standard of like let's not be angry.
Yeah.
Even God got angry, but he was slow to anger and he didn't let the sun go down on it.
Yeah, and so he kind of spends the rest of chapters 4, 5, and the beginnings of 6 kind of saying again, so if this unity has been claimed by Jesus in his death and resurrection, how does that look for each one of our relationships? And then I think he sums it up really well in chapter 6, verses 9 and 10. And he says, so he's talking about masters, how they treat their slaves. And so he says, masters, do the same to them, aka be serving and remembering, to be good, because there is unity. They're actually your brothers and sisters now. Right. So masters, do the same to your servants. Give up using threats. After all, that the master in heaven is their master's and yours, and he is the respecter of no persons. Mm-hmm. And then what else is there to say? Just this: be strong in the Lord and in the strength of his power. Put on God's armor. Why? So then you'll be able to stand firm against the devil's trickery. The warfare we're engaged in, you see, it isn't against flesh and blood. It's against the leaders, against the authorities, against the powers and the rulers of the world in this dark age, and against the wicked spiritual elements in the heavenly places. And so he gives you all this practical how do we treat our relationships? And then he's like, hey, and if you're not doing that, if you're not treating people with love and kindness and unity, remember that they're not your enemy. The enemy is the one behind that saying, hey, you actually, there is separation here because they're under this authority, they're under my authority, they're different things from you. And he's like, hey, just remember, our battle is not against flesh and blood. It's against the lies that Jesus' kingdom is not actually reigning over the powers and the authorities. And then I love, his response to that then. And so he's like, so put on the full armor of God. And that's like, every man Bible study's favorite place to go. Right. But the point is, like, the only way that you combat that is with just God's truth, living and coming back to it over and over and over again, that you have to wake up in the morning and put it on and be like, this is the reality I'm stepping into. Even though the world is going to show me something different, the reality is that Jesus is the king in my life. So if I'm not treating my spouse well, then I'm just letting down the fact that Jesus is king over us both, and that we're both made in his image, so to speak.
And like Chris said too, it's gonna be uncomfortable to do that. Yeah, like once you put on the armor of God, once you live your life in a way that is attempting to mirror the life of Jesus Christ, you are going to feel extremely uncomfortable. Yeah. And like, here's like a practical example of that, like you've told me as well. It's like, you can choose to live your life in a way that shields you from getting hurt by other people. You can like push people away. You can like act a certain way to hold people at arm's length. And that's going to make you very unhappy. And it's going to be because of your actions that you're unhappy. Or you could choose to live your life in a way that's like very loving, very inviting. And like, that's probably also going to hurt you sometimes. Like, you're going to expose yourself to just getting hurt and manipulated and whatnot. But if you do, it's not going to be because of you. Like, you are living your life in the best way you know how. And if someone else chooses to, hurt you through that, then that's not necessarily on you. It's going to be extremely uncomfortable, but at least you are waking up every single day and choosing to live a life that is loving and inviting and much different than those that are around you.
Yeah. And when you do that, you're proving to both the earthly powers and the spiritual powers that Jesus is king. When you choose to treat every relationship as one that is for the love of God, then you're proving to those spiritual powers that they have no place here, that they don't have authority over you. And to the, I'm just getting practical now. It's like, I feel like there is the powers in the United States are telling us, like, there's separation of, like, man and woman, and, like, one political party is like for the men, one political party is for the women, one political party is for white people, one political party is for black people, and like, that's what they're trying to tell you over and over again. And like, this is just so practical. It's like, you don't actually have the authority here. Like, you don't. Like, Jesus has the authority over my salvation from like spiritual evil and over my salvation of these relationships with people.
And I feel like Paul too is like, okay, is it a little scary for you to accept every single human being radically and just like treat them all the same? Like, let me get really specific for you. And like, for anyone who's like listening to our message of like unity and just like, and in my own head, I'm like, I could never do that. Like, I'd fail at that every single day. Really, Paul's like, well, do you have someone that you care about? Like, do you have a husband or a wife? Like, do you have a child? Like, why don't you start there? And he gives some incredibly practical advice on like how to be in those relationships. And I feel like if you just take that every single day, try to be like that, and then expand that out to anyone else that you come in contact with, that is you following Paul's instruction here.
Yeah, and to go off that, talking about Paul's instruction, something to be thinking about too is that everything Paul's talking about here is just breaking down Jesus' teachings. Yeah. Like, it's not more than that, because it can't be more than that, because it's what Jesus is saying. But that also gives it a lot of power. And so you see, like, every time I see the armor of God, like, I kind of give like a heavy sigh, and I'm like, not this crap again. Like, I'm tired of it. But like, if you look at those things, righteousness, faith, like, all those things are just attributes of
Truth.
Jesus.
Mhm.
Like it's just what Jesus displayed, but he's giving it to you practically. Because Paul is saying what Jesus did is confusing and tough,
Mhm.
but it's true. So like, let me help you understand what that was.
Well, and like, do you find this letter confusing? Like, you have to listen to it over and over and read it over and over to understand it? Well, then, like, literally, thank God that we have the Gospels. We have
Yeah.
4 different accounts of Jesus going through life and being like,
Mhm.
we can have bracelets that say, what would Jesus do? You know, like, we have the ability to think to ourselves, what literally would he do? What did he do in his life? And just mirror that.
And if it helps for you to think, like, you know, I have my breastplate of righteousness on. Okay, like, what should be going, like, what should be on me is righteousness. People should see that. That should be my actions. Like, then great. Like, that's awesome. Do that. But if it's better for you to go, okay, how did Jesus live? Like, I should live that way. Like, they go together, is all I'm saying. It's not like only listen to Paul, only listen to Jesus. Like, Paul is just explaining what Jesus is talking about.
And that's why I think it's so cool the way that we kind of opened and are closing with this is he states it right off the bat. What is the good news? And the good news is that, Jesus has delivered you from sins and you've been forgiven when you put your faith in him. And what is the implications of that? There are 2 implications. One, that he's conquered the spiritual evil powers that were working in the whole world and in you personally. And he's conquered the earthly powers that are trying to divide you, that are really just kind of pawns of the spiritual powers anyway, but it's just easier for us to be able to accept that.
Yeah.
And so then it's like, so what, how do we live? And all he's doing is just drawing the implications out of what it means that Jesus was God, lived an incarnate life here on earth, died, and then was resurrected. What does all that mean? And he's just pulling the implications out, and that's all. So I think it's helpful. It's super helpful. But I think sometimes we do have this tendency to go to Paul first and be like, okay, so how do I live as a Christian? Mm-hmm. And he's like, well, the only reason I'm living and calling people to live like this is because of what Jesus did. Mm-hmm. So it's probably best that we know what Jesus did.
Yeah.
For sure.
Yeah, I'm super thankful for Paul's letters because I remember, like, when I first wanted to start reading the Bible, I went to Paul's letters because I knew I could understand them. Mm-hmm. And I missed a bunch of stuff, and every time I read it, I get more. But I knew that, he would lay it out in a very practical way, and it's because he wrote these letters to churches that were living practically as a church. So, like, these are probably the easiest thing in the Bible to apply to myself. Yeah. But they are just expanding on the truth that is Jesus and, like, the way he lived his life. And I think Paul is something that we should all strive to be like, realizing that he's still a flawed human.
Yeah. If you were going to sum up our conversation in 1 minute, what is Ephesians all about, Harry?
Ephesians is Paul addressing a group of believers, and he stresses unity, stresses practical ways to emulate Jesus, and not just for the sake of doing so for yourself, but for the sake of doing it because Jesus died for you.
Sweet.
It's perfect.
Love it. Yeah. Awesome. Cool.
There's Ephesians.
There it is. We did it.